Cool. It's recording, and we're doing this again. So I'm just gonna jump straight into something real quick. I didn't do a video every day this week. It kind of bugged me, maybe, because I said, I was gonna do this every day. I don't want to be like that guy that says, well, I'm gonna go to the gym and work out. I'm gonna turn into a lift, bro. Just get swole. I'm just gonna get swole. I'm gonna lift every day, and then like 3 weeks later, he's eating Cheetos and not going to the gym. I don't want to do that with this, not to you guys, or to myself. And I don't think that's going to happen per se, knock on wood. I think that happens when people kind of have too high of expectations, and first off, what they're doing is something they don't like doing. I've been liking this. The biggest constraint, at least yesterday, was I was just so tired, and I needed to get more than 8 hours of sleep, which I did. And the other day I just didn't do it. But I'm doing it tonight, and I know exactly what I want to talk about. It's an interesting thing. It crossed my mind thinking about this, just because I'm a little bit older now. I have certainly left the nest for my parents, and this is a kind of a bigger subject that probably won't fit in this video. So I'm going to mark this as a part 1. And I don't even know if I'm going to do a part 2. I'm just going to say part 1, and then I'll leave it open-ended to this. Someday I might do a part 2 on this. If I get more feedback or more comments I think about, and people tell me more of their perspectives on it, and maybe the conversation and understanding of it kind of gets deeper. But I'm just going to put it out there. I'm a millennial. Or whatever, and I went on to Google or Wikipedia, and it said that a millennial is someone who turned into or lived into a young adult after 2000 or whatever, after the new millennium, or something around there. You can correct me somewhere on YouTube with a comment, hey, that's not exactly millennial or whatever, which I don't really care. But it's just the gist of it. I'm a millennial. I'm in my early 20s, and people are always talking about the Gen X, Gen Y, all that stuff, and employers, and what does it mean, and millennials in the workforce, and like 1/2 or 1/3 or 1/4 of them living with their parents past 25 or whatever, which is a good deal because I don't live at home. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Millennials, being a millennial, and some of the things about it, some of the stereotypes, some of the things about them. First and foremost, I'm a bit biased, but I do think that in terms of the workforce, I think millennials will probably be the most productive employees ever in the history of recent history. I think we'll be more productive than most people, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And I do think that some of us, not all, because I think one thing about being a millennial is that there's a bit more of an extreme on all ends. But I was reading a report about some millennial person. It was some chick. She was in a workforce, and she was saying how, all these stereotypes of millennials, that they're lazy, or that they expect everything, or that they're really prissy, or that they need all these perks to be incentivized to work or to do anything, or that they're always on their phone, they're always tweeting, they're always Instagramming or Facebooking or whatever. They're not doing work, and that it's really hard to attract talent and all this stuff in the workforce, and that the companies know what to do because we'll just leave and go to a different company, and we'll just Google some other place to go work at or whatever, which is probably a bit true. Let's go a little bit deeper. I think I can add a little bit more perspective on this, or in the sense that my parents are old. And I'm not saying that like a millennial old, okay? Like, I'm not, oh my god, you're 35, that's so old. No, that's not what I'm saying. Like, they're 65. Okay, they were born in 51. Okay? Like, the war had just ended. The war. We hadn't been on the moon yet. The moon was 18 years away when my parents were born. We were 65 now. Yes, 64. And, I grew up with that. Like, I was born, turning point of 39 to 41, and my sister and I, and whatever. And so there's that. And it's like, I grew up with old parents, so I only know their perspective. Like, I know a lot about the 50s, the 60s, well, not so much the 50s, because my parents were like little kids, so they don't really even remember that much. They just remember going to the lake and stuff like that. But you know, I grew up hearing stuff about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And so because of that, there's a bigger generational gap between my sister and my parents. Which I guess for my sister and I, we don't really care. It's like, oh, they're just older. But to my parents, I think it kind of bugs them, or it worries them a little bit. And not in a negative way per se, but it's just like, I think they're always wanting to get on Facebook or whatever, like, you know, learn about something else. And I think they just don't want us to forget about them. And I won't. They're great parents. They did a good job, I think. But I think they worry about that a little bit. And I think it's a little bit more exaggerated because, like, their childhood growing up was nothing like mine in terms of the technology. Like, not even, like, my dad remembers when the TV became color. And he remembers when the number of channels went from single digits to double digits. Okay, that was their technology. That was amazing. You know, I had a cell phone in mid-school, for Pete's sakes, which, you know, I can see how someone said it's not healthy or whatever, but I don't care. But it worked out. But that's the thing. So I'm going to go a little bit more into why, like, I think people, specifically in the 30s and 40s, kind of look at millennials and they're like, okay, you guys are spoiled brats. Now, I think that's kind of the case with any generation, because in any generation you have accumulated wealth that just accumulates over time. It's passed on generation to generation, assuming that one of the generations doesn't squander it and ruin it for the next one. But I think there is, like, you know, there's obviously an accumulated wealth, and I think over time, and I'm talking specifically just in America for the last 200 or so years. I'm not talking about like the Egyptians. I didn't live there. I don't have any recent knowledge of that. I'm talking specifically America. So there's that perspective too, which is America is not like any other country. Like we're wealthy and everything's just awesome. Like, so take that in mind. But I'm specifically talking about America, 1800s, 1900s now. Things have progressively gotten significantly better generation after generation after generation in terms of the commoditization of inputs and just the input costs of things just becoming cheaper and cheaper and significantly cheaper after every time, just because technology and innovation and capitalism just runs its course and does a really good job at that. And there's also some downsides, but that's a completely different question. But things just get better, and I think, and people just make more money. I mean, granted, you know, there's this whole stuff about the 1% and the 99. It's like, okay, there's data that says that's true, but it's like, being a 99%er has gotten way better every generation, even if you're just going to stay with that. Like, there was like oxes and buggies and dirt roads, and then like the next time they were paved, and then the next time, a few times that, you know, that time, then you had trains, and then after that you had oil, and cars were starting to come in, and then you have really fast cars, and then you have, you know, computers, TVs, radio. Well, radios came in before World War II. But things have had significant advances just within someone's initial life. You know, assuming that the average person, you know, had a kid from 20 to 25. So every 20 years, the new generation comes in. In those 20 years, significant advances have roared on through. So I do think when people talk about millennials being spoiled, it's like, yeah, totally, I would agree with that. Yeah, we're spoiled, but you're spoiled too compared to your parents, and you know, so it's technically my grandparents. And then, you know, I know for a fact that my grandfather thought that my dad and my aunts and uncles were spoiled, rotten, because he grew up in a farm in the middle of nowhere, and you know, during the Great Depression, not just the Depression, and his kids had it great, you know, down in Southern California in the 50s and 60s, like, oh my gosh, that's like the best place to be. Amazing weather, and it's not ruined yet because there's way too many people living there and overcrowded. Like, that was when Orange County was Orange County, meaning they grew oranges. It was fields after fields of orange growth in Orange County. That's why it's called Orange County, because they grew so many damn oranges. That was when they were making oranges still. And so my grandpa obviously thought that my dad was spoiled rotten or whatever, maybe not spoiled rotten, but had more than enough stuff. And I know for a fact that my great-grandfather, great-grandparents thought that my grandpa had it great because he had a car. Okay, he was engineering cars. My grandfather was an engineer, and the family lineage before that was farming. They didn't have cars. They had to have an animal pull a chunk of metal through the earth. Okay, they didn't have an engine on that. Like, that was work. So I think when people say that we're spoiled in the other one, yes, but so were you, and so were your grandparents, and so were your great-grandparents. I mean, you can go on and on and on. I mean, just imagine, when the train finally connected the United States. There was that grandpappy that was like, back in my day, we didn't even have trains. Like the Oregon Trail. Literally, we had to be on wagons, and you are so lucky you have a train. You just buy a ticket, and in 10 hours you're there. So yes, we're spoiled. Let's just get that through. Let's just get that out of the way. Yes, I'm spoiled. It's amazing, it's awesome. You are too, compared to your parents, and your parents compared to your grandparents. We're all spoiled. We had all this accumulated wealth, accumulated technology. My kids are gonna be way more spoiled than me, because like who knows? They might be like, Dad, I didn't get to go on this space trip like Timmy did. Like stupid stuff like that. Like, Dad, how come he has a holographic phone and I don't? Like, that's gonna happen. That's gonna happen. That's gonna be like the next thing. So just get used to it. We're spoiled. But let's move on to something even more important, which is, because I was reading about several articles about us having expectations of everything all at once, that's beyond a normal mean. And I think it's really important that we take an even broader step back, if you will, and take a look at what information is, what knowledge is, what's a religion, what's a belief, what's a set of values, what's a set of ethnic standards, how do people live? And I think it's really important because there's a clear line in the sand, which is pre-computer days, which is every day except the 6, post-World War II, like basically in the 60s, that's when computing, and it was computing, they weren't computers, like just take a look at the old IBMs, okay, like they were entire buildings to make a calculator. So they were computing centers. They were places where everyone had to go at once and compute numbers. Personal computers really didn't come into their stride until the 80s. I mean, yeah, there were home kits in the 70s and things like that, but it wasn't until the 80s where the idea of a personal computer really came into play. So that's a really start. We need to acknowledge that, because every other invention historically was still isolated geographically. Data was still geographically. Like when we talk about information and talking about knowing things and us becoming smarter as a species, we have to remember that every other single civilization, we can go to, let's go with Egypt. That's really simple. I mean, we had to chisel things into stone, okay? You can't just email a stone tablet. Like look at Moses. Moses had stone tablets. That's how they had the 10 Commandments. He had rocks, 2 big rocks with rules on them. Like, that took a long time to make. And like, what if you lose them? Huh, you're screwed. You gotta go back up to the mountain and remake them. I mean, there's no Control-C, Control-V, okay? You just can't do that. So information, stories, knowledge was very much isolated geographically. And I think one of the most interesting cities to study is Alexandria, because Alexandria was a city that was created because, well, by Alexander the Great, literally, and the city was known for having some of potentially the largest collection of knowledge ever, period, in one place, in the library there. And that's why it flourished so much, because it was a center for free thinking, free ideas, and knowledge. But what people forget is that one of the Achilles heels of Alexandria was that the knowledge, the wealth of knowledge, and it was wealth. They were one of the richest civilizations on the planet at the time. 300 BC, by the way, this is around there. 300 BC is when it started being created. The problem with Alexandria that it was hidden. Only the elite, only the rich, only the wealthy had access to it. The common man did not. And that is the stark divide. And that is America. You gotta be listening. That's one of the things that I think will be one of the defining characteristics that America will ever die on. Will knowledge and information and access to knowledge and information be kept privately away from the majority, or will we learn our lessons from Alexandria and invest in every person having the opportunity to education and every person having the opportunity to know anything, regardless of wealth, gender, ethnicity, all that stuff. But you have to understand that every single civilization had its own group of its own knowledge about what the world was. You had you had Asia, you had India, you had the Near East, the Middle East, you had Europe, you had scant civilizations up and down the Americas, you had the Native Americans, you had the Aztecs, the Incas, and all that stuff. Information was huge, and the guy who had the most knowledge won. But it was very much isolated. It was very much encapsulated. And if you study about how that kind of transpired and moved across the earth, it happened very slowly. And so when people talk about knowing things or where we were as an advanced, where we were as a civilization or as a species at the time, we need to remember that the vast majority of what we were, our stories, our religions, our cultures, our, for lack of a better word, scientific understanding of sometimes I wouldn't even label it science, of how the earth was created or how this happened or why things exist. You always remember what I'm talking about, the earth being flat. We need to remember that information was really hard to maintain, and it was really hard to transfer from person to person. The best thing that we had was a piece of papyrus, in Egypt, and basic inks, and then books became really expensive because they're expensive to make, and so most people didn't have books. Most people couldn't read. And let's go back to America at this point. If you take a look at the Revolution, you had the Civil War, and then you had the Industrial Age around all that, and then you have the movement into the space age and the age of the computer. I think that the defining characteristic of a millennial, and this is amazing, this is incredible that I'm able to even witness this. The chances that I was born during the year that I was born is, the biggest difference, I think, is that let's go all the way back from the Egyptians all the way to when computers were made. Information was expensive, and information was localized, and it was stuck geographically to wherever the book was. Everything was on a piece of paper somewhere. That was knowledge. It was either in your head as a story, or you just knew it. And you played that telephone game where people talking in one person's ear and then the other person's ear and then the other person's ear, and you can just tell how fast information gets disseminated and disorganized and manipulated. So the only real credible way to have information was on paper, but even then someone could have a paper, copy it, rewrite it as they wanted, and switch it out. So we need to remember that libraries were the thing. That's where you went. The library was so important because that's the only place you could go where all those books were there. And all of the newspapers were there. I mean, people really only got information from very few sources on a regular basis. They either got it from the news, they got it from whatever mail, and back then mail was sent on a horse in the United States. Everyone remembers the Pony Express. Or you went to church. Let's be honest. Religion was a very huge component of our life, and not just in America, but everywhere in the world, because that's the only place where you learn things. I mean, think about it. Like, honestly, think about it. Like, you went to school, and then maybe you went to school until you were 16, and then you had to start working on the farm. I mean, people forget that, in the 1800s, it wasn't until the early 1900s that over 50% of the United States population started living in urban areas. most people do not remember or are not mindful of the fact that we are farmers. We are very agrarious. That's the only thing that's the only reason why we're able to support ourselves. You know, we were localized farmers and we made a living off of that. The vast majority of people's heritage and ancestry is that people who farmed and worked the land or made tools. You know, you always talk about carpenters or people who made tools to facilitate that kind of economy. And granted, you also have the, you know, you kind of have from 1000 AD to, you know, like 1700, there's a huge growth and starting in terms of ships and sailing, and there's that whole mercantile system. But we need to remember that information, the questioning of information and the data of information, and basically our ability to perceive the world was very limited, and it was a day-to-day thing, and they came from very few limited sources. And so I think in a lot of ways people didn't have much of an expectation in terms of having things available to them. People grew up in the way where their entire perception of the world was limited. It was limited to what they learned in the news. It was limited to what they heard on the radio. It was limited to what they watched on TV. TV didn't have very many channels. Before that, it was who wrote this in the news or what did my pastor say on Sunday. That's all you had. That's all you had. And so that's the difference. I think that's the big difference that millennials see, because once we had the computer, more specifically the internet, that completely blew away. Now and forever, hopefully, if we don't kill each other, that blew away the geographic barrier of data and information and knowledge. And I think the biggest difference when I think about myself, my sister, my friends, versus my parents and my friends and their parents, you know, the millennial versus the non-millennial. And I mean, it is really humbling for myself to think about where I am in history, because this is insane. This is insane. The camera, YouTube, the internet, Twitter, Facebook, it's insane. It's insane. I program computers. No one has ever programmed computers before. People have been lawyers. People have been merchants. People have been farmers. People have been doctors. People have been all kinds of professions. No one has ever programmed a computer before. No one programmed a computer in the 1600s. No one could program the computer in Egypt. No one transplanted our minds and put it on a computer. There was I really like how Steve Jobs said, he talks about how the bicycle, when you take the human versus say another animal, we're not necessarily the most efficient in terms of caloric movement, but once we invented, like in terms of, you know, calories expended per mile, but once we invented the bicycle, it completely shot up. And I think he really did say it best when he said that the computer was the bicycle for the mind. And we live in our minds. We are thinking conscious. That's very important to remember. Conscientious creatures. And in all those other times prior, we didn't have a tool for the mind. I mean, and that's not quite true. We did have books. And people forget that when books came out, and this is true, people forget that when books came out, people said we're going to become idiots. People were saying, once everything's in a book, we'll never have to remember anything. People will forget how to tell stories. People will forget facts. And it's the same thing when you hear people about talking about how once now they have the computer and the internet, people will forget all this other stuff. And yeah, we will technically somewhat lose it, but we will have also gained the ability to assimilate and amass and construct an understanding out of a much larger sums of data and learn such deeper means of what that information means.